Hey everybody, welcome to the Wood Samaritan. I'm Rob. Today I'm going to show you how I made this mobile small parts organizer and bench. So let's get started on the build. The idea behind this project was being able to use these plastic small parts organizers and dividers, kind of like this, to be able to keep all your different bits separated and organized. And they are placed into the open shelves on each level here. Now, this is not the size that is actually going to go into this unit. The customer this is for has his own plastic organizers that fit these spaces exactly. However, the concept is the same here. We also decided to add some drawers to the bottom here to allow for extra storage, in addition to the parts organizers that will go on each shelf. The cabinet also has an 1.25 inch thick top for a nice sturdy work surface, and also a place to put the parts organizers when you have them out from the storage shelves here.
I started by drawing everything up in SketchUp just to make sure it would all fit together the way I wanted and the dimensions were going to work for the size of the cabinet. Then I figured out my cut list by putting all the parts into the cut list optimizer website, which is a great tool. If you've never used it before, I'll leave a link below. Next, I broke down the sheets of plywood using my track saw and then cut them to rough dimensions on the table saw, leaving about 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch on each side so I could cut them again using a better blade to get nice clean edges with no tear out on the edges of the plywood. Some of the bits were also cut on the miter saw. Then changing to my finer tooth blade, it was just a matter of cutting all the bits to their final dimensions, labeling them with some blue painter's tape and getting nice clean edges. Here's all the bits together. Next, I moved on to cutting down the maple. After ripping it to rough dimensions, I used my feather board here to get it down to the exact strips that I was going to use to make the faces of the shelves. Checking the thickness to make sure they're as exact as I want them to be before starting to glue anything onto the shelves. Then it was just a matter of cutting them to roughly the dimension before gluing them onto the shelf pieces. I left them a little long so I could trim them off later. After laying out all my clamps, it was time to start gluing. Taking each piece of maple, I glued it onto the front of the shelf and then proceeded to clamp it, making sure that it was aligned, that there was material to trim on either side, and wiping any of the glue squeeze out away. Once that was done, it was a matter of letting them dry and then using my hand plane to trim down the edges of the shelves, the maple on the shelves, to get a nice clean alignment with the edge of the plywood. There are definitely faster ways to do this with power tools, but I find doing it by hand gets the best result. Next, I drilled the pocket holes, which I happened to forget to record, but here's a photo showing all the pieces with the pocket holes drilled in them. Using my Kreg jig, it only took about 90 minutes to do all 188 holes. Next, I moved on to putting the first few layers of finish, which is a water-based polyurethane, onto the shelves and the side pieces. Doing this ahead of assembly just made it a lot easier to sand and to get a nice clean finish on each piece. After getting all the dust off, I moved next on to applying the finish, which took quite a while, and I think I did about 4 coats, so I didn't include all that in here, but then it was a matter of moving on to assembling the bottom of the structure, which was a 1/2 inch and 3/4 inch piece of plywood glued together, and I used a little cut off of the 3/4 inch to make sure that the gap was appropriate. Once the glue had set, I took off all 1,000 of the clamps and threw them in an angry pile, then moved on to gluing up the top, which was also a piece of 1/2 inch birch plywood with a 3/4 inch piece of baltic birch on top of it. This made for a nice thick 1.25 inch top piece, which was very rigid and gave some good stability to the cabinet when it was being used as a bench as well as a storage unit. While the top was drying, I sanded the face of the shelves to 320 grit and applied the first few coats of finish. With the top now dry, I put it through the table saw to trim off about 1/8 of an inch on either side just to get a nice clean edge. For the ends, as it was too wide to go through my table saw, I used my hand plane just to take a little bit off. Next, I used my jointer just to clean up the edges on this piece of maple before taking it over to the table saw. Now I cut the piece of maple down to the dimensions I wanted to use for the edge of the top piece. Again, cleaning up the face here on the joiner before cutting them again to the final dimensions. With the maple cut roughly to size, I moved it over to the miter saw and cut the 45s for the pieces. I took my time and did a dry fit here using clamps just to make sure everything was going to go together the way I wanted before putting any glue into this. Once I had everything properly lined up, it was a matter of taking a piece off at a time, adding lots of glue, given I was gluing it onto the end of the plywood, and making sure it got clamped up and aligned properly. Overall, I was pretty happy with how this came together. While I was waiting for that to dry, I moved on to assembling the main part of the cabinet frame. Using glues and pocket screw, I attached the middle and side uprights to the base. My workbench is quite flat, so I used that as a reference surface to make sure the bottom was lined up square and flush before attaching it. With that done, it was a matter of moving on to attaching the shelves one at a time. I cut a couple pieces of scrap plywood to the exact height that I wanted each shelf. That way I could get consistent spacing as I moved up the frame, adding each shelf one at a time and using clamps to make sure everything was held tightly in place before screwing it in with pocket screws. You'll notice the gap on the bottom, and as I move up there is different. That's because the drawers on the bottom need a wider opening than each of the shelves where the plastic storage units go. With the top piece now dry and out of the clamps, I started to trim the excess maple from the edge using the hand plane and also using some of the sander. I did realize partway through this that using the shop birch, or the cheaper 1/2-inch birch plywood for the underside of the top, may not have been the best choice, given it has a very super thin paper veneer on it that once you get through it, as you can see here, it starts to show the red of the glue underneath. Now for this project it didn't really matter because it was hidden in the underside anyways, and at one point here I just decided the easiest thing to do to get a clean edge on the underside would just be to use the flush trim bit here in the router. After a bit more sanding, I flipped the top back over and added a 45-degree chamfer to the edge all the way around using my trim router. Next, it was time to start adding the finish to the top. I started with the underside, putting 2 or 3 coats on before letting that dry overnight. Before doing the final sanding on the top, I made some homemade wood filler out of sawdust from the top and wood glue and used that to fill in a couple of minor holes. Once that had dried, a quick sand and I was ready to do the final touch-ups. Here I'm just doing the chamfer on the corners. After a little bit more hand sanding, it was time to start applying the finish. I did the first few coats and sanded in between with 400 grit sandpaper just to get a nice smooth finish. I think overall I did roughly 7 coats, which may seem like a lot, but the water-based polyurethane goes on pretty thin. I do thin it out with water just to get it to level off really nicely. When I was done, I added some paste wax here, citrus wood paste wax, and buffed it off with a cotton terry cloth. Overall, I'm really happy with how this top came out. It is glassy smooth and shows the wood grain really nice, and I like the contrast between the plywood and the maple. The next step was to assemble the drawers. This is just 1/2-inch plywood glued together and secured with pin nails. I found the pin nails to be more than enough to hold the plywood together while the glue dried, though I did use clamps and corner squares just to make sure it dried square. With the main box done, I moved on to gluing on the base, which is also another 1/2-inch piece of ply. I did cut this roughly 1/16 to 1/8 of an inch wider than the size of the square, which allows me to use the flush trim bit on the router to get a nice clean edge that matches the profile of the box exactly. Once they were dry, I gave it a quick hand sand with 150 grit sandpaper just to take off the sharp corners. I then cut the drawer faces to their final exact dimensions and moved on to installing the drawer slides. I used a scrap piece of 1/2-inch plywood to get the spacing off the bottom for the drawer slides to be the same, and measured carefully to make sure they were going in square and in the same spot on either side. With the slides in where I wanted them, I used another couple pieces of 1/2-inch plywood underneath the box to have it at the right height, and then proceeded to slowly pull it out and attach the screws to the side. To attach the drawer face, I checked the gaps all the way around, clamped it where I wanted, and then used a couple of screws from the inside of the drawer to attach it. I then repeated the process for the second drawer. Next, I attached the back onto the cabinet using the bendy drill attachment I have for getting into those tight spaces inside the openings. After a quick once over with the flush trim bit on the router, it was time to apply finish to the back. With the back finished, it was time to attach the top. After checking to make sure it lined up the way I wanted, I added some glue and clamps to hold it in place while I secured it with the pocket screws from the inside. With the glue dry, it was time to take the clamps off and start the final cleanup. Give it a once over with the air hose, a wipe down with the microfiber cloth, put the drawers in, and basically it was done. Overall, I think this turned out pretty great. It's probably the nicest piece of shop furniture I'll ever make. It's very sturdy, very strong, rolls around real easy, and is going to work quite well for the customer that this is for. I really like how the maple grain shows through on the face frame, and the contrasting colors between the plywood and the maple.
This is my first YouTube video, so if you have any feedback or comments or types of projects you'd like to see in the future, please feel free to leave those in the comments below. If you enjoyed watching this video, please give it a like. Also, if you want to see more projects from me like this or other DIY or upcycling projects, please feel free to hit the subscribe button, the bell in the corner. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you next time on The Wood Samaritan.